Our speaker is David Pike. David L. Pike is Professor of Literature and Film at American University. He is co-editor with David Damrosch of the Longman Anthology of World Literature and co-author with Anna M. Acosta of Literature, A World of Writing. His most recent monographs are Subterranean Cities, The World Beneath Paris and London, 1800 to 1945, and Metropolis on the Styx, The Underworlds of Modern Urban Culture, 1800 to 2001. He's published widely on 19th and 20th century urban literature, culture, and film, Canadian cinema since the 1980s, At the Heart of the World, will be published next year by the University of Toronto Press. His session today is entitled Reading Globally, Writing Locally, World Literature in the Writing Classroom. David, are you ready to begin?
David, we can't hear you. Would you be able to speak up a little bit?
All right, we can see the cursor moving. We know you're out there. Thanks for your patience, everyone. We'll just, I'm sure we can. We've got you now, David.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay.
Gotcha.
I took off my headset and I'm speaking directly into the computer. Nothing like technology. All right.
Thanks so much.
You can hear me and you can see my screen then, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we're good to go.
All right. Reading globally, writing locally. As I tried to mention before, and apparently you didn't hear me, I'm going to read a short bit to get me over the nervousness of speaking to an invisible audience. Thank you all for attending. I sort of thought that it would be easier to do this, but in fact it's much more difficult when you can't see your audience because there's no liminal space. I'll be talking about liminal space later. In the meantime, in today's global and multicultural society, many of us are looking for ways to broaden our students' horizons without abandoning the familiar Anglo-American framework and our students' often expectation of texts that they recognize and are familiar with and have cultural capital in literature courses and writing courses. Today I want to suggest some practical strategies for incorporating world literature and multiculturalism into the traditional writing and literature classroom. Globalization has had two visible consequences for the teaching of writing and of literature in introductory courses especially. The increased presence of international and minority students in the classroom and the increased presence of multicultural and multiethnic literature on the curriculum. Neither of these phenomena is in fact new. Rather, what has changed is a different articulation and theorization of long-standing classroom demographics and pedagogical practices. While their presence is not new, the status and visibility of international students and multicultural texts has become central to debate over teaching at the introductory level. Now I'm going to start by briefly defining multicultural and world literature and presenting a few broad reasons why it is worth incorporating them into our classrooms. And then I'll devote the rest of the talk to practical strategies for doing this. So I'm going to switch from the craft perspective of the last talk to thinking about particular classroom strategies. I'm hoping this will be helpful both to those of you who are just starting to think about doing this and those of you who have already experienced are experienced at it, and I hope to hear from you at the end of the talk about both your experiences and your ideas in incorporating this kind of literature into the classroom. And I wanted to briefly comment on the two photos on my first slide, which are, I suppose, standing in for things that literature provides in situations that it responds to. The one at the top I'm sure you will all recognize as a panoramic view of Rio de Janeiro from the top of its most iconic monument, and thinking of the global panorama and the wide view that reading world literature can give us. The bottom one, most of you will probably recognize Ethan Hawke. Some of you will know the film, especially paradoxically those that teach Shakespeare. This is Miguel Almireda's 2000 adaptation of Hamlet, and this is the to be and not to be speech, which he sets in a Blockbuster video store. Besides liking the irony of being set in a store that no longer exists because now everything is done online, I love the idea of thinking of something else that world literature does, which is it not only helps us travel through space and think about the way that different parts of the world can speak to each other, but it also allows us to let text speak together through time. And so what we have here, in other words, is a play written, 500 years ago, in a contemporary setting, and thinking about how those things fit together, as well as the extra idea that an existential crisis in the modern day would have something to do with how to choose what to watch among all the many choices, which this talk is also about. Because one of the difficulties of introducing multicultural and world literature into the classroom is, of course, the fact that there are already too many texts to teach, especially in Intro to Lit class. And that's why, again, I think the argument needs to be made about how all of these texts can work together. Okay. My screen is refusing to move. There we go. So, briefly, definitions. What is multicultural literature? Quite simply, literature about people who are not in the nation's mainstream. What is world literature? All literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in their original language. Both of these terms, in a sense, are about texts that travel, people that travel, about migrations and movement. And there is, to a certain degree, although they are distinct, there's also a fair amount of overlap between them, which is worth briefly thinking about. And I was just jotting down a few names as I was thinking about the talk this morning. Someone like Jhumpa Lahiri, for instance, born and raised in the United States, but who sets much of her work in India, if not with recent immigrants settling in the States, which again is, so you could call her books, her stories, and her novel both multicultural and world literature. You could also think of someone like Orhan Pamuk, the Turkish writer who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, who I will briefly touch on at the end of this talk, although I don't think I will have time to do more than briefly touch on him, who spent most of his life in Turkey and now lives in New York, where he teaches at Columbia University, but continues to write, in a sense, world literature. So you have both world literature people living in the United States, multicultural literature everywhere, but the general definition would be multicultural literature is about people not in the nation's mainstream, Americo, Barron, and Silverman referring to the United States, versus literature that is coming from somewhere else. Although, again, you could argue that what makes multicultural literature both interesting and challenging is precisely because it comes from somewhere else. So why teach them? I'll start with the sort of broadest general philosophical reason given by James D. Rees in that rectangle up at the top. Through careful guided inquiry and by linking disciplinary study to the world at large, we are preparing students to be well informed about socio-political issues around the globe while still meeting curricular requirements. And then if we put this into bullet-pointed form, great writing, both past and present, this is amazing literature, and it rewards teaching. It's just wonderful to teach, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. It reinforces critical thinking skills. World literature and multicultural literature challenge us in ways that literature more familiar to our own context doesn't, precisely because it asks us often very pointedly to step outside of our comfort zone in various ways. It often highlights what that means It also, by teaching them in combination with familiar texts, you also need to increase your focus on thinking comparatively, which will always reinforce critical thinking skills. Third, because it reflects reality. America is multicultural and contemporary culture is global. So in a sense, this is, and that moves into the last point, this is the way of the future. Our world is going to become more and more multicultural and more recognizably multicultural, and so it's worth the effort to figure out how to make it work, as opposed to waiting until it sort of bangs on our door and forces us to, if it hasn't already. So what I want to do for the rest of the talk, and the main part of it, is to discuss some practical strategies for incorporating multicultural in world literature in either the writing or the introduction to literature classroom. Some of these would also work in more advanced literature classes, but I'm primarily thinking of the kind of writing-intensive introductory courses that most of us mostly do. And I'll first start with, this goes incrementally, and I'll start with the smallest doses. How to first start introducing it intermixed with what's familiar, because they actually work together. Second, thematically, where we find that multicultural and world literature can be taught under similar thematic rubrics, although they often will allow us or force us to view those rubrics differently. So incorporating certain multicultural or world lit texts into a thematic unit. This is also works if you're thinking of incorporating them into a genre unit, short story, play, poetry, for example. Third, using visual materials, and I'll talk about 3 different ways of using visual materials to introduce this literature. This is sort of the unspoken subtext of the course, is why visual materials work so well with world literature, multicultural literature, especially as a way of easing students into them and making it easier for students to have access to these texts, because students think so much more readily in a visual manner than they do in a verbal manner, especially in terms of writing. Visual materials often find a way of making a bridge to texts that might otherwise be forbidding or difficult, and I'll talk more about that. And then finally, and this is the POMIC at the end of the talk, clustered in context, given a more in-depth consideration as a case study. In other words, when one chooses to do a unit solely on a particular world literature or multicultural text, as opposed to incorporating them within a conventional Anglo-American framework. So, example of small doses, starting with a poem which you and many of your students will be extremely familiar with, William Carlos Williams' canonical poem, This Is Just to Say. I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. Since we're very familiar with this poem, I'm not going to say a lot about how one might or might not interpret it. What I want to look at this point is what happens if you tweak this from a multicultural perspective, as Tino Villanueva does, a Puerto Rican American who wrote this poem in 1984. Variation on a Theme by William Carlos Williams. I have eaten the tamales that were on the stove heating and which you were probably having for dinner. Perdóname, they're riquísimos, so juicy and so steaming hot. What happens when you put these 2 poems together? The first thing one can do if one gives this to one's students and talks about in discussion is to notice in the comparison what Villanueva has kept, in particular the form, the topic, the I have eaten topic there, the forgiveness at the end, and what he has changed. And to think about the patterns formed by that change. First off, what has he added? He's added 3 terms in Spanish, self-consciously foregrounding his own perspective, whereas Williams writes from what appears to be sort of a universal perspective. We might recognize, after reading Villanueva, and think of the plum as an American or European fruit. Think of the coolness as this sort of perfect modernist idea of literature as something cool, abstract objective, although it does have that wonderful concreteness that Williams has. Whereas Villanueva heightens the specificity of the standpoint from which he's written the poem. Not just the Spanish language, but of course the fact that he changes from coolness to heat. And playing again on the culture, our cultural assumption, the stereotype, if you like, of Latinos, Puerto Ricanos as hot, passionate, tropical culture versus the sort of Anglo-American coolness so characteristic of Williams in this poem. And you can follow this up in different ways. And one of the things I think is fascinating to notice, of course, and to think about, because I don't think it's decided within the poem, is to what degree Villanueva wants us to see this as an expression of his or a Puerto Rican identity, and to what degree he expects us to think, to question our assumptions about all of those sort of stereotypes I just mentioned, to question those assumptions. I ask this particularly because of the fact that you can mention to your students at the end of the discussion, which is that William Carlos Williams' mother was Puerto Rican, so that he himself was multi-ethnic, multiracial, and to think about if it changes their reading of that first poem, to think about it that way. Has Villanueva, in that sense, changed how we think about William Carlos Williams? If we reread the poem from a multicultural perspective, we could think that it looks as if he's repressing a specific identity beneath that coolness. I don't think that repudiates the prior meaning of Williams, writing in the context of the 1930s, but Villanueva, I think, is partly suggesting by that rewriting that from the perspective of 1984, Williams looks very different. So that's one way you can take an existing canonical Anglo-American poem and, in a sense, spice it up, change it by bringing in a version that's something that's connected to it in a very focused way. Something similar, but in a deeper manner, can happen if we take another very familiar poem, Dear John Wayne, and think about it in particular thematic forms. This is written by Louise Erdrich, who was mixed race of a Chippewa ancestry and I think a German American. Her father, I believe, was German American, who used Native American settings, themes, and characters in most of her writing, although I'm not sure exclusively. And I'll read this one as well. And as I read it, and as you read it, I want you to think especially as the setting, because when I teach this poem, I don't teach it in the setting of a unit on Native American literature, in a sense in a multicultural unit. I teach it in a unit on space, and in particular on in-between spaces. Spaces that that one is moving through or only temporarily in, and to think about how the spaces and settings we are in affect the kind of experiences we have. So as I read it, think about the setting in it. Dear John Wayne, August, and the drive-in picture is packed. We lounge on the hood of the Pontiac, surrounded by the slow-burning spirals they sell at the window to vanquish the hordes of mosquitoes. Nothing works. They break through the smoke screen for blood. Always the lookout spots the Indian first, spread north to south, barring progress. The Sioux or some other plains bunch in spectacular columns, ICBM missiles, feathers bristling in the meaningful sunset. The drum breaks. There will be no parlance, only the arrows whining, a death cloud of nerves forming down on the settlers, who died beautifully, tumbling like dust weeds into the history that brought us all here together, this wide screen beneath the sign of the bear. The sky fills, acres of blue squint and eye that the crowd cheers. His face moves over us, a thick cloud of vengeance, pitted like the land that was once flesh. Each rut, each scar makes a promise. It is not over, this fight, not as long as you resist. Everything we see belongs to us. A few laughing Indians fall over the hood, slipping in the hot spilled butter. The eye sees a lot, John, but the heart is so blind. Death makes us owners of nothing. He smiles, a horizon of teeth, the credits reel over, and then the white fields again glowing in the true-to-life dark. The dark films over everything. We get into the car, scratching our mosquito bites, speechless and small as people are when the movie is done. We are back in our skins. How can we help but keep hearing his voice, the flip side of the soundtrack still playing? Come on, boys, we got them where we want them, drunk, running. They'll give us what we want, what we need. Even its disease was the idea of taking everything, those cells burning, doubling, splitting out of their skins. The last few lines are a reference to John Wayne's death by cancer, bringing in a biographical connection at the end after it spent the majority of the poem focusing on his screen persona, or the screen persona / public persona, since they overlapped, as opposed to the private fate of his body. So what I would focus on here, in addition to sort of thinking about what Louise Erdrich is saying to John Wayne, is in particular notice at how she frames that interaction with him through this group of Indians at the drive-in theater. They're not shown on the reservation. They're shown in a quintessentially American post-war space, the drive-in theater, acting like quintessentially post-war Americans. They're watching Westerns like everybody else did in the 1950s. And so she's simultaneously presenting the Indians as Americans and as somehow viewing Americans differently because of their specific viewpoint. That last viewpoint would be, again, the viewpoint that could be brought by multicultural literature. And she very, very carefully gives us that image of them moving out, leaving when the movie is done, back in their own skins, which also suggests to us that their identity is not fixed by what they see in the film, even though this is in a sense a very an identity they might feel trapped in. And you find this ambiguity, this ability to occupy different subject positions in multicultural literature and world literature, and a lot, especially those set in the States. And I want to give you almost a contrary example from Sherman Alexie, a somewhat younger Native American writer, also about John Wayne. And this, all of what I'm introducing here focuses on John Wayne and on movie Indians, and thinking about the different ways that one is represented on screen. I hated Tonto then, and I hate him now. However, despite my hatred of Tonto, I loved movies about Indians. I loved them beyond all reasoning and saw no fault with any of them. I loved John Ford's The Searchers. I rooted for John Wayne as he searched for his niece for years and years. I rooted for John Wayne even though I knew he was going to kill his niece because she had been soiled by the Indians. Hell, I rooted for John Wayne because I understood why he wanted to kill his niece. I hated those savage Indians just as much as John Wayne did. Alexie is an extremely irony-laden writer, although there's a large dollop of sincerity in there as well. What I would do with this, besides comparing his ability, which I take sincerely to identify with John Wayne when watching movies, because that's of course how movies work, with the particular film he's talking about, and there is a still here that's hopefully showing up for you on your screens from The Searchers, and I put a link to the YouTube of the video. The program we're using doesn't allow me to stream video, so I put a link to it so that you can see the particular clip. The Searchers is a very loaded example precisely because it's in The Searchers famously that John Wayne deconstructed his own persona and portrayed a racist Indian hater who was so virulent in his racism that he, in a sense, becomes totally banished and excluded from civilization, from society. He becomes this permanently liminal character precisely because he cannot deal with his hatred of the Indians. And this is dramatized especially in the scene that I've given you a link to, where his adopted nephew, who has been searching with him for years and years for their kidnapped niece, who's now grown up with the Indians, although she's still Natalie Wood. So how seriously we can take her having been assimilated is an open question that the movie asks us. This is John Wayne over here, his head hidden by the leader of the posse. But John Wayne in this scene basically at this point says, living with Comanches ain't living, and explains how he intends to kill the niece when she finds her, because she has, as Alexie mentions, been irrevocably soiled. So in other words, what I want to suggest here, and there's not time to piece it out in detail, but what I want to suggest is sort of a cluster or constellation of themes around the ability given by these two, this brief essay and this poem, to see the contrary and contradictory different kinds of ways one can react to a traditional piece of American culture. The Searchers perennially ranks among the top 10 ever of films made. So thinking about what a classic looks like And to me, it's much more complicated than simply rejecting its depiction of Indians. And both Erdrich and Alexie are doing something much more complex. They're, in a sense, reading critically and thinking critically through this tradition that they grew up with, and which is a part of their own identity at the same time as it repudiates elements of that identity. A final piece of this constellation that brings together this thematic unit and of thinking in particular about what happens to you in these liminal spaces is a wonderful movie from the late 90s called Smoke Signals, which is based on a screenplay. It's filmed from a screenplay by Alexie based on his often anthologized short story, This Is What It Means to Say Phoenix, Arizona. And while The Searches is maybe a little bit too intense to present in full for an introductory lit class, though it would be fascinating for a more advanced one, Smoke Signals works perfectly, partly because it's structured as a comedy, partly because it does such a good job of dramatizing in a serious but very funny way the complexities of Native American identity in the 1990s through the point of view of those Native Americans themselves. And it's fascinating to watch them as they move through and argue and make fun about the different positions they occupy. This is focused on the two characters you can see sitting on a bus. Most of the film takes place on a bus trip between Washington State and Arizona, where the one on the left, Victor, who plays the sort of traditional tough, silent, tough, stoic, he's not silent, stuffed, stoic, po-faced, completely serious Indian, and his not quite friend, but companion, unwilling companion from boyhood, Thomas Builds the Fire, who plays the this other stereotype of Indians, the one who is steeped in lore and mythology and nerdiness and closeness to nature and loves to tell stories and has watched Dances with Wolves 200 times, which Victor is taking him to task with in the clip that I've also linked you to here. And in this clip they're discussing, Victor is trying to teach Thomas how to be a real Indian, thinking again back and sort of meditating through the whole question of what a movie Indian is, what a real Indian is, how we're affected by what we see and what we read. And again, the fascination for me thinking about how to frame all of these issues through, not through the question of multiculturalism, as through the question of space. All of these debates and discussions are possible because they're in these spaces, and I think framing them this way for our students diffuses what many of them at this point have as a natural suspicion towards the whole question of multiculturalism, and allows them to see that the texts are raising really interesting questions, precisely because one's not approached them qua multiculturalist, but as texts that illustrate a different kind of theme, a different kind of principle. So that's my discussion of a thematic approach to introducing multicultural. Now I want to talk about visual materials in the time that I have left, and I've adapted this schema of three ways of using visual materials in teaching from a neat little article by Deandra Little and Peter Felton. You've got the reference to it here, and is again an incremental movement from using images as illustration, the spoonful of sugar, and you can see me doing this on that slide, and especially give a nice little visual mnemonic. And this is not meant to put down the idea of images illustration, but to be conscious of when you're doing that, when you're using images as a means for interpretation, and when you're using images, as they call it, images as illumination. And I want to distinguish between these second two terms. Image as a means for interpretation is using images as a way of making a particular kind of argument, outside argument. Images as illumination is the image itself provides that argument. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. First, though, I want to run through the two images I've given you here and suggest some of the ways you could, again, use these as an inroad or introduction to particular kinds of issues or particular kinds of literature. Both of these are from Central/North America, Mexico, and El Salvador. The first is a very eerie and disturbing photograph by Susan Meiselas from the height of the violence in El Salvador in 1980. I've generally taught this with, Carolyn Forché's prose poem, The Colonel, which deals with that same context. What I like about it and what I think you can notice just as soon as first of all, the way that it works only with shadows. And think about the effect of its use of these shadows to portray an image that is not in itself violent, but that evokes a very frightening sense of violence, partly because it doesn't show us anything except, the title of course means a lot, soldiers. We know that there's soldiers over here. The bus passengers here, especially this one with the hands on the head, giving us the sense of danger. But to think about what the shadows do to that image, as opposed to if we simply had a direct image of soldiers pointing their guns at the bus passengers. And again, there's an enormous amount to go into here. I would just suggest a couple of possible starters. For me, the most evocative, especially from the perspective of 2011, is the shadowy presence of this violence within our own culture and our own history. The way that something that we do not have a direct connection to, most of us, tends to come to us in this kind of shadowy sense. And I think Meiselas is very conscious of photographing in that way. She's very conscious that she's photographing for an American audience that will not have any direct connection to this particular space, but also hence the shadowy status of the violence itself. This is extra-legal violence. It's happening in a way that's not documented. One would want to think about her own function in that space and what's happening to her at this moment. And the whole idea of the shadow is something that raises issues. And of course, if you're going to start talking about photography, the way that she's thinking about the very mode of her own photography, since photography is based on the whole idea of shadows and light. The second image, far more representational, but a nice image to any kind of writing about and thinking about Mexico in particular, is the great modernist artist Diego Rivera's mural, which is in the National Palace in Mexico City, the great city of Tenochtitlan, from 1945, where he creates a whole, in a sense, creates a national mythology around the existence of the Aztec city Tenochtitlan on the site of Mexico City, which was both paved, sort of built over and preserved at the same time, mostly built over, but somehow thinking about the remnants of that culture, in a sense, inserting the presence of indigenous culture within what would have been in the 19th century in particular, defined in terms of the relation to the colonial power. So a whole celebration of indigenous life and culture focused again around the presence of this city within the capital of Mexico today. So two examples of images that one can interpret, images that make one think, and that make one think in a very concrete, specific way, and that then could provide an inroad into reading as well. Now, for images as illumination, I'm going to use this image 4 times. And here, I've called this a picture in its 1,000 words, because I want you to look at this image and imagine what it's about without a caption. And this is, again, as an exercise that I give my students to get them starting to think about how images work. Normally, when we see an image without a caption, we tend to look at its visual components and its formal and aesthetic components. You would think in particular about the composition, the way the wall bisects the screen, the presence of the, I don't know if it's a sunrise or sunset in the background, the fact that we don't know who these figures are, what they're looking at, or even how they're standing at the top of a fence. What's there on the other side that's allowing them to stand like this and peer over? Thinking of how enigmatic the quality is here. I don't know if we notice this garbage in the foreground or not, which makes us think again about what we're seeing. But then I want to see what happens when we put 3 different captions on this image. Now that we've sort of thought about what's going on in the image, first caption, and this is the one it was published with by the Associated Press. As the sun sets over the Pacific Ocean, 4 would-be illegal immigrants from left, Geraldo Sanchez, Fabian Hernandez, Fernando Garcia, and Arturo de Jesus, sit atop the border fence in San Isidro, California, Monday, October 5th, 1998, waiting for the cover of darkness to sneak past the U.S. Border Patrol. The citizens of Pacific Beach and community in San Diego list illegal immigrants as one of their top concerns as they consider the candidates in the upcoming election. So think briefly about what that caption does and how it constrains the meaning of this photograph, in particular subordinating those four characters to the identity of illegal immigrants, which presumably they are, but which also presumably is not the sum total of that identity, and then subsuming that identity within an illustration of what is basically an article about San Diego, the San Diego community, which is getting ready to vote for candidates, presumably on the way that they're going to deal with people like this. This caption, in other words, has completely transformed the meaning of this photograph. Not that that meaning isn't available here, but what it has is it has eliminated other possible meanings. What do those other meanings look like? Well, let's try two other captions. Caption version 2. 4 young Mexicans atop the border fence in San Isidro, California, 1998. A flat, objective caption that places them without telling us how and what they're doing. Presumably many of us would think of them also as illegal immigrants, since that's such an important facet of Mexican identity within the contemporary American discourse. But if we identify them as Mexicans only, that allows us to wonder what they're thinking and what they're looking at. If we look at this image, we don't have to wonder what they're thinking and what they're looking at. We know. Here we don't. They have a certain kind of subjectivity and a certain kind of autonomy that comes from not being named in that way. Finally, what happens if we look at this image in connection with Jimmy Santiago Baca's famous poem, "So Mexicans Are Taking Jobs from Americans"? Watch the image again as I read the poem to you and see how it changes. Oh yes, do they come on horses with rifles and say, "Ese gringo, give me your job"? And do you, gringo, take off your ring and drop your wallet into a blanket, spread over the ground, and walk away? I hear Mexicans are taking your jobs away. Do they sneak into town at night? And as you're walking home with a whore, do they mug you, a knife at your throat, saying, "I want your job"? Even on TV, an asthmatic leader crawls turtle-heavy, leaning on an assistant, and from a nest of wrinkles on his face, a tongue paddles through flashing waves of light bulbs, of cameramen rasping, "They're taking our jobs away." Well, I'm going about trying to find them, asking just where the hell are these fighters? The rifles I hear sound in the night are white farmers shooting blacks and browns whose ribs I see jutting out and starving children. I see the poor marching for little work. I see small white farmers selling out to clean-suited farmers living in New York who've never been on a farm, don't know the look of a hoof or the smell of a woman's body bending all day long in fields. I see this, and I hear only a few people got all the money in this world. The rest count their pennies to buy bread and butter. Below that cool green sea of money, millions and millions of people fight to live, search for pearls in the darkest depths of their dreams, hold their breath for years, trying to cross poverty to just having something. The children are dead already. We're killing them. That is what America should be saying. On TV, in the streets, and offices should be saying. We aren't giving the children a chance to live. Mexicans are taking our jobs, they say instead. What they really say is, let them die, and the children too. So, in other words, this same photograph, which can function as the document of illegal immigrants and, in a sense, the document of why we would not want illegal immigrants in a community like Pacific Beach in San Diego, can equally serve, and I think both meanings are available in the photo, as an argument reinforcing Jimmy Santiago Baca's poem, "So Mexicans Are Taking Jobs from Americans." It can do many things at the same time depending on how we frame it and how we teach it. And I would argue that the same thing is, this is what I've been saying all for the last 40 minutes about multicultural and world literature. Both the importance of how you frame it, but the fascinating ways in which it can frame and reframe material that we already teach. And I think I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to leave for a minute on this page, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today, though I would be happy to post the slides if people are interested in looking at them, on ways of teaching someone like Orhan Pamuk in his own context, in his own right, if you like. But thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions either now, or if you don't have time now, feel free to email me, and in a minute I'll move the slide up to the first slide where you can have my email, although I'm sure Amy can also provide it for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. I was wondering, as you were talking, so much of this has to do with kind of reframing and getting people looking more at, I want to say thematic, but I mean something larger, more of like a human, the theme of, you know, the human condition, or the context of humanity. And that's kind of a big shift. I don't know how your students are situated, you know, relative to that kind of conceptual framework, but I know for a lot of students that would be a big difference in how they've had sort of multicultural, you know, the other sort of set out there as something they need to look at instead of, you know, sort of look through or look with. And so I was wondering about some of your assignments in this kind of context. Do you have students doing a lot of writing, or what are some of the ways that you get students to kind of engage with this way of looking?
Well, to assume what I've given you today are, in fact, almost all assignments that I would give in the class, in the sense that what I like to focus on, precisely because I found students are suspicious of multicultural and world literature for two reasons. First of all, because they find it often too serious, too dark, and too depressing. And secondly, precisely because they worry that all they're going to get to think about are big questions, and I suppose not the way that they want to think about the big questions might be the way of thinking about it. They're happy to talk about big questions in, say, Shakespeare, most of them, say in Hamlet, thinking back to the beginning, but they're not necessarily happy to talk about big questions the way, say, Jimmy Santiago Baca might portray them, or the way Orhan Pamuk might. So my assignments tend to be very specific and constrained, so that they get to those questions, I should inductively, through careful reading and critical thinking, as opposed to starting with the big questions, in a sense already knowing what they're going to want the text to say. Especially because a lot of multicultural literature especially is very, we could call it hortatory, I suppose. It's almost hectoring at times, and it can feel that way if you think of Dear John Wayne, where if you read it superficially, it feels like she's just giving the finger to John Wayne. And if one approaches it directly, I find not that she's not giving the finger to John Wayne, but she's doing it in a really fascinating way that can lead us to other things, and that, of course, we don't need to give the finger to John Wayne in very different meanings. So how do I get them to see different kinds of meanings? That's why I was suggesting, instead of approaching it solely through multicultural issues, approach it through a formal or thematic question like space, like a liminal space or an in-between space, so that they're thinking about it first in terms of setting, and looking closely at the setting then allows them to get to the issues, but in a contextualized and more rigorous way, as opposed to just in a big ideas shooting the breeze kind of way, which students, of course, love to do.
Sure.
If that makes sense as a distinction.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I guess I was wondering if you're having them do that primarily through writing, or primarily through discussion, or, you know, how do you get them to kind of engage the topic? Is it really a discussion-based kind of thing, or do you have them kind of writing toward these kind of things in chunked writing assignments and stuff like that?
That's a good question. I suppose both. It depends on the class. I would always start with discussion. I mean, if you think back to some of I mean, most of these I would say are discussion-based. I could see giving them an assignment to watch that clip and then compare how that clip works with Alexie, or to watch these two clips together and think about how those two clips work together. But a lot of these I'm thinking of discussion-based, actually classroom work. Though many of them I could see, I mean, this could either be a classroom work, especially with small group work, or it could work as a writing assignment where, for instance, if you've already read if they've already read and discussed William Carlos Williams' poem on its own terms, then you could give a writing assignment of doing a compare and contrast between the two, and then have them come in and talk about it. To me, the important thing is the incremental process, as opposed to and it's a critical thinking process, opposed to whether it's being done in a formal setting, in an informal setting of writing, or whether it's done in the classroom or out of the classroom. I would incorporate all of those and sort of going step by step through a various process so that you're building in various ways on the particular text and on the particular theme.
Mm-hmm. Christy Ewell was wondering if you think that the reception of multicultural literatures is easier or more difficult in a diverse student body.
That's a really good question. I just finished teaching. I teach an introductory cinema studies class, and I taught the Hurt Locker last year and this year, which takes place, of course, in Iraq, and has a very complex depiction of the Iraqis because it depicts them as blank ciphers. It makes no effort whatsoever to portray them as rounded people, so it in a sense portrays them the way it suggests the soldiers see them, as these sort of incomprehensible inhabitants of a world they don't understand, with a couple of exceptions. I discovered after the students started posting for the discussion that two of the students in the class were Iraqi. One of them had lived in Baghdad for 2 years, and one was also a member of the armed forces, which is a different kind of multiculturalism that we don't think of. But so we had completely divergent. It ended up, because of that film, and I suppose because the film was open up, they said, first of all, they found the film extremely painful to watch. I think both the member of the armed forces and the two Iraqi students. But they ended up bringing fascinating points of view because they could understand the Arabic that was being spoken in the film that wasn't subtitled. One of them complained that Baghdad was portrayed too much as a slum, and that in a sense it doesn't look like that for the most part. It's not all sort of horrible, ugly, terrible neighborhoods, but in fact it looks like a fairly normal city. But they were also translating what was happening in the very scene. So it ended up being a very important resource. But I could just as easily see it raising all sorts of complicated questions. So for me, I wasn't aware of that at the time. If you're teaching it in an open setting where you're assuming that a text is going to produce different kinds of readings and meanings for different students, students will be able to feel free to respond in different ways. If you're worrying about a text being in a sense univocal and only giving forth a single viewpoint, even think of that again of the Baka poem, which is very polemical, but is also open in peculiar ways. If you're attentive to the openness of the text and the ambiguities, I think students will respond more and feel more comfortable bringing in their own subject positions and their own identities. But it can be very complex. I mean, and it's something that one has to think about as one's planning, and especially as one's trying to know one's students.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that being an especially important consideration in that kind of context. I think we have time for this is a sort of a short question. Darlene Proctor was wondering, when you go through to build your class, do you change it up significantly from semester to semester, or are you kind of building and refining the same frames and texts from one semester to the next?
That's such a good question, because it's such a hard decision to make each time. Because I was actually talking about this with Anna recently, because because the problem is when you teach things more than once, you have the chance in a sense to know how they're going to work and to really carefully scaffold what you're doing, but then you also lose the excitement of doing something for the first time. Which I find really brings a lot of sparks into the classroom. However much I try to make myself excited doing something the second time, it's never exactly the same as when you're doing a new text and you have the fear and excitement of how it's going to work and how it's going to function. And so I suppose what I normally try to do is try to figure out, and I haven't found it exactly, it changes of course, a happy medium between keeping things that you know work and that you know what they're going to do, and then interspersing them with new things so that you also can keep that sense of the freshness. And students notice both things. I don't think any student expects you. Maybe they probably don't think about this. I don't think we expect ourselves to do a new course every time, and I don't think one would teach very well if one did something new all the time. But I think changing things up does keep one an active reader as well. It keeps one's mind agile and keeps one from becoming set in certain ways, which is so easy to do because we're all overworked. We also know things that work, but all of you as teachers know that, strangely enough, things that work in one class one time may completely bomb the next class in another time, because students are different, classes are different. One can't predict everything in that way. Mm-hmm. So it remains a mystery, I suppose, would be my totally unsatisfying answer to that question.
Well, I don't think any of us have a totally satisfying answer to that question in any class. You know, how to do that, how to strike that balance. You know. Well, David, unfortunately, we're out of time. I thank you so much for your great presentation, and I can see from the comments that a lot of people felt as enthusiastic and inspired about it as I did. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Amy. And I've got my email there on the slide, and I know you have it as well. If anybody wants to contact me after, I'd be happy to respond to any other questions or have further discussion about this. Thanks very much.
Thank you.